The things that I notice most of the time that is not specified when we're looking at specs on certain pieces for upholstery is the stitching. And so today we wanted to go through and share with you what the basic stitches are so that you know how to specify them and you can actually see what they look like. So we are going to note all of it below after the video so that you can see it and know how to specify it. And let's get to it. First thing I'm going to talk about is plain seam. And a plain seam is just one single stitch. This is on a regular kind of plain fabric. And it's just two pieces that are brought together and sewn on the machine, and it's just one seam. So usually with a regular fabric, we will recommend an additional stitch just to reinforce the fabric. But the only time that we really recommend a plain seam, and that was a vinyl, this is a leather, is on velvet or mohair. So this is an actual velvet, and because of the way that the velvet is with the nap and the thickness of it, it always looks better usually with a plain seam. So this is a velvet and this is a mohair. So you can see that it really looks nice and clean, and it really is a pretty detail. This, just so you all know, is called overlocking, and it's what we do on most of our fabrics. We don't do it on leather and we don't do it on vinyl, but it's always good to check and make sure that the fabric is overlocked and that you put that in your spec, because it will help in case the fabrics are laundered or dry cleaned, and it will not unravel. So that overlocking really reinforces the end of the fabric. So when we talk about plain seam, as I said, it's really good to do plain seam on a velvet or a mohair. But we really, as a standard, utilize what we call top stitch or French seaming. And top stitch on leather looks really, really pretty. And what it is that we take the fabric and it's sewn just like a regular plain seam, like we showed you at first. So it's plain seam, but then they take the fabric and they fold it over and they seam up one side. So usually we try to do it in a similar color to the actual leather or vinyl, which we can show you here in this vinyl. So we've got a similar gray color, but what happens is it really reinforces the seam, and it really helps for hospitality, and it's a really pretty detail. So you can specify this as top stitch or French seam. When you get to mohair, as I just showed you, it really kind of pulls the hairs a little wavy, and it really just does not do it justice, and it really is not a pretty look. It doesn't look very clean. So we don't recommend top stitch on mohair. And on velvet, it can look okay, but as you can see here, it's pulling the fabric a little bit in a strange way, and it just doesn't look as nice. So it kind of gathers the fabric. So again, don't like that. Don't like top stitch on the velvet, but this is on the plain fabric. And I really recommend doing, again, minimally a top stitch on a plain fabric. If you have a two-tone fabric like a black and a white, that's where it gets a little bit difficult, but we can select one color or the other. And the top stitch just really, again, reinforces the seam. So that's a plain fabric, and that's top stitch or French seam. The next thing I want to talk about is a double top stitch. So this has come up a lot recently, and it is very similar to a baseball stitch. I'm going to compare the two so you can really see those side by side. But as you can see, with the double top stitch, it's a smaller point. So it's a smaller individual stitch. So we're taking this top stitch that I just went over and we're running it up and down the seam on both sides. A baseball stitch, we're taking a double needle machine and we're running it through one time, and the point on the machine is a little bigger. So that really is the difference between a double top stitch, which you can see here, on plain fabric. And then I'm gonna show you also on vinyl. Again, on the mohair, not a favorite, so we really don't wanna do that. And on the velvet, the double top stitch really doesn't look great, so we're not gonna do that. But the double top stitch on the leather is a very pretty detail. Again, a little bit more refined than the actual baseball stitch, which again, if I put them side by side, you can see the difference. Okay, same thing goes for baseball stitching as it does for the double top stitch. Again, on the velvet, just doesn't look that great. Okay, but again, with a velvet, with a vinyl or a leather, it really is a nice detail. Again, either the baseball or the double top stitch. So you can kind of see the difference on those two. Okay. The other thing you'll notice is that this stitch is a little flatter. And the reason why is because we use a tape on the back that helps keep the stitching straight for the double needle machine. So that is actually another way to reinforce your seam that we really don't do on anything else but a baseball stitch. We don't do that on the double top stitch because this is something specific to the machine that we use that does the baseball stitching. On the mohair, the baseball stitch, again, just not that great. The tape does help this one stay pretty straight, but again, because of the hair in the mohair, it just tends to pull it a little bit different in each stitch, and there's some areas that almost look a little balding or pulled, and it just doesn't look straight. So it's a detail, again, we don't recommend for that. So that's kind of some of the single top stitch, the double top stitch, the baseball stitch. One of the ones that we use really most often, again, is that top stitch, which is a standard of Lily Jack. The next thing I just want to show you all is welt. And this is not a typical welt. It's a very small welt. This is the smallest that we do. It's a 1/8 inch welt. And this is just kind of the difference. As you lay all the different materials out, whether it's regular fabric, you can just see how it looks, the very, very small 1/8 inch welt. But when you're using leather, it's a little thicker. It has a little thicker look on it because the leather is a little thicker than regular fabric, but that's that small 1/8 inch welt. And on the velvet, you know, it's pretty good. We like using it on velvet, it's okay. But sometimes the welt can do the same thing that we saw with the stitching, is that it can pull it a little strange just because the velvet is so soft and the way that the fabric works. But this one looks pretty good. Some velvets have a little longer pile. So again, this kind of area that looks a little balding here, that might show up here and there. So that's something we always are on the lookout for. And if we see it doesn't look right, we'll usually let you know. Okay, so that is some of the small welt detail. And then the last one, which is a new seam that I just found out about today as I was working with our cutting team and getting these samples ready. This is actually called a pinch seam. And I thought it might be more of a flange seam, but it's not, because it really does have a double fold of the fabric here. And this is just called a pinch seam. Now, it could work on the top of an arm of a chair. That would look really nice. We can also do a flange detail, which I've shown you guys before in our pillow video. Doesn't look that great on the velvet, so probably wouldn't do that. And I would assume it's not gonna look that great on the mohair, which it definitely does not. Again, because of the fibers being longer, it just kind of gets this strange look on the edge and it doesn't look straight, so I wouldn't do that. But it does look nice on the leather and the vinyl. So that's one option there, and this is called a pinch seam. So that's something that we will add to our list of different seams that we can do and different stitching that we can do. And this is for a body of a sofa or a chair. It's for a cushion, it's for a back pillow. All of these seams and all of this stitching detail can be specified and can be used on anything you're doing. We will mark all of the different details below, and I hope it was helpful. I hope you guys learned a little bit about baseball stitch, top stitch, French seam, double top stitch, micro welt, which is also what the 1/8 inch welt is called. And also, I learned something new today, a pinch seam. So everybody take care, stay safe, and we'll see you next time when we go over whatever else you guys recommend. So thanks again, take care.